is 12:02 in Eastern time. I hope you guys can hear me.
I can hear you.
Welcome, everyone. This is Marcos. Before we have the seminar series today, and before we start, I'd like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded. So please keep your microphone on mute and send your questions in the chat box. I will read them at the end of the presentation. And today we're delighted to have Dr. Nicki Viall discussing mesoscale solar wind structures, their creation and the magnetospheric impact. Dr. Nicki is a research astrophysicist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center with expertise in solar coronal and solar wind physics. She was the 2018 recipient of the Karen Harvey Prize, awarded by the Solar Physics Division of the American Astronomical Society, and currently serves as SPD AAS Vice Chair. Dr. Viall is the mission scientist for the polarimeter to unify the coronal and heliosphere mission, and currently serves as the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on the Solar and Space Physics. Okay, thank you, Dr. Nicki. You can start from here.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm so excited to be here talking to you all. Let me start and make sure, oh, I have to share. Practiced all of this and then I forgot what I was doing. Okay. That. And all right, if that looks good, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And like I said, I'm so excited to be here. It's actually been probably about 15 years since I really talked to a dedicated magnetospheric audience. So this is really exciting for me. From the introduction that Marcos gave, you can see I've mostly been working in the solar and solar wind physics, but I actually started in the magnetosphere, so that's going to be part of the story I tell here. All right, thanks to the Punch team and the Whisper team and the internal scientist funding model at Goddard, where most of this research that I'm going to be talking about was supported. All right. Okay, there are a couple of review papers that I've recently been a part of where a lot of this information is, if you are interested in it. The first is as part of the AGU Centennial Celebration. Joe Borofsky and I wrote a Grand Challenges paper on outstanding questions of solar wind physics. So a lot of this is in there. We also wrote a review paper on the heating of the solar corona recently. That was part of a book series that came out. And then the third one was mesoscale structures in the solar wind review paper that we published in Frontiers last year. So a lot of the material that I'm going to be going over actually is probably in one of those three reviews. Okay, and then the other thing that recently happened, and I think this is actually where Kyle got the idea to have me come present to this group, was that we had a joint Gem Shine session at this year's overlapping Gem Shine Day on June 26th, because we could finally meet in person and really have some of these discussions. And we led the session, how does the solar wind and magnetosphere coupling change in different types of solar wind? The idea being, you know, sort of there was this old paradigm of it's fast solar wind or it's slow solar wind, and that you could derive coupling coefficients based off of that. But it turns out it's a lot more complicated that both the way that the solar wind is formed and the types of solar wind that are formed, and so then the resulting coupling between the solar wind and the magnetosphere. And it is more complicated than that, but the great news is both our modeling and our observations are finally getting to the point where we can actually start tackling this in a real way. So the premise of this joint Gem Shine session was that the ambient solar wind is really highly structured on mesoscale. So not just the big global, but the smaller scale, the mesoscale survive to Earth lot of the sort of daily space weather, the ground state of space weather is what I've been calling it. So it's not the big CMEs, not the big, SIRs, but it's sort of the daily driving. So we had a series of talks where we sort of started at the sun and worked through all the way to the magnetosphere on some ways that we were tackling this. And honestly, we spent a lot of time on kind of tutorial level material, just because we still have a lot of work to do, in my opinion, to get all of our communities talking and speaking the same language. So I hope that in the future we can have more of these crossover discussions where we're really bringing the communities together. Also, I lead a working group at Goddard, part of the internal scientist funding model package, tackling a piece of this. So that's a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the really big picture that we're going after here is, what are the dynamics of the Sun-Heliosphere connection? How is it that the solar wind is being created, and how does that affect the heliosphere and affect the driving of the magnetosphere? Of course, that's what a lot of our missions in heliophysics are after right now, this coupling. And so here you can see the composite image of the sun. The sun in ultraviolet is in the middle there. It's taken with SDO. So you're looking at the solar corona at about a megakelvin, 1,000,000 degrees. That middle ring was from the 2017 total solar eclipse. And you can see the complex way that that structure low down in the corona goes outwards into the solar wind. And so the outer ring there is a SOHO field of view in white light. So you're seeing the density, you're seeing the young solar wind being formed there. And one of the key takeaways is the solar wind just does not come straight out from the sun. There's this very complex topology driven by the magnetic field. So as I said earlier, on a large scale, we know the answer to this. We have large scale structures in the corona, such as coronal holes, quiet sun, that create fast and slow wind, and different types of wind. Those create things like co-rotating interaction regions, stream interaction regions. On the big scale, we know this connection. We also know this connection, time dynamics, of course, coronal mass ejection, solar storms. That's the big way that we know this happens. But these effects happen on mesoscales every day. Here's a video. Oops, that was not a video. Let me go back. There's a video. Okay, this is white light images taken with there. And what you're seeing is a lot of just ambient solar wind that is already filled with structures. Already just the regular old solar wind, when it comes out, has all of these structures in it. And this is, as I said, from stereo. So you're looking at white light. It's just the density coming off the sun is what you're seeing here. This is also stereo core 2, and this is a special high cadence deep exposure campaign that we ran just of the core 2, this outer field of view going from about 5 solar radii to about 15 solar radii. You can just see all of the dynamics. It's sepia toned here, but really the point is, look at all the structures that are filled in this, young solar wind. The corona constantly makes these structures. Not big CMEs, though that also happens, and not just the big stream interaction regions, but these little stream interaction regions that are going to turn into little compression regions. And what I've done here is I took a corner in the upper left and I pulled it out, and I'm showing the dayside magnetosphere to scale as that blue dot. And the reason I'm showing this is just to highlight, now I'm playing the movie on the right here as well. So that blue dot is the dayside magnetosphere, about 10 Earth radii there. And you can see that these structures that are small in our coronagraphs are actually quite large compared to the magnetosphere. So I'm calling them mesoscale structures. They're enormous compared to the magnetosphere and compared to kinetic scales, but they're small compared to what we're usually used to think about tracking, like big CMEs. And you can see these mesoscale structures that just fill the corona are large compared to the day-sized magnetosphere. And so that's why we need to understand them. But it is hard to understand them. And I'll talk about that in a second. So let me now backtrack. That's sort of just a taste of the current state. Let me go back in time to the magnetosphere. Back in time to when I studied the magnetosphere, like 15 years ago. Okay, so ULF waves, ultra low frequency waves in the magnetosphere, so we're talking about periods of minutes to tens of minutes, are well known, this is an old result, are well known to drive magnetospheric radiation fault dynamics. And this is just a result showing a correlation between ULF waves and relativistic electrons. So we know that it's important to understand ULF waves in the magnetosphere, periodicities in the magnetosphere. And there were a lot of periodicities seen in the magnetosphere. And for a long time, it was thought that these longer period ultra low frequency waves in the magnetosphere, think like PC5 waves, were cavity Hey, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. It kicked me out, but I'm back. All right. Host disabled participant screen sharing. I think you have to make me a co-host, please. Again.
Hi, yeah, I'm trying to do that, but I'm also the co-host. Okay.
There we go. Got it. Thank you. Oh, thanks for your patience on that. I don't know what happened. Anyway, here we are. I was revolutionizing the field and declaring that actually a lot of ULF waves are externally driven by the solar wind. And so here is a result actually from Kepko et al. 2002, so 20 years ago, showing solar wind at L1 having these long range 90-minute quasi-periodic structures with embedded 20-minute structures within them. And then when you time shift that to the magnetosphere and you look at what's going on in the ghost magnetosphere, day-side magnetosphere has these same long period oscillations with embedded shorter scale 20-minute oscillations, and they're being directly driven by the by the solar wind. Okay. So that's when I took over that project and started looking at the statistics, not just did this happen, but how often did it happen? Because people had been seeing ULF waves at particular frequencies for many years. This was sort of a little mini review that I did in 2009, where I summarized people who had done occurrence distributions of the ULF waves in the magnetosphere, taken average spectra of the ULF waves in the magnetosphere, and in a number of different ways, they kind of concluded that there were particular discrete frequencies that kept showing up, but they weren't always the same ones, which is, and so again, were some of them cavity modes or some of them these directly driven ones? We decided to answer that in a more systematic way. And we started looking specifically at these ones that were directly driven by the solar wind, density being dynamic pressure. And those of you who remember this era, remember there was this whole controversy about the magic frequencies. Why would there be particular frequencies in the magnetosphere? And maybe it was the cavity modes, except the cavity takes on different shapes. So why would they always be at the same frequencies? And anyway, it turns out that a lot of these frequencies come from the solar wind. And here's another event, just another example from our 2009 paper where we showed wind L1 density, solar wind, having these, in this case, there was a 1 hour frequency, a 20-minute frequency, a 10-minute frequency, and a 4-minute frequency. So these multiple embedded scales, and all of them come through and directly drive the magnetosphere. So the left is the time series and the right is the spectra showing the discrete frequencies coming through. And so we wanted to systematically look and see how often this takes place. And so we did a statistics of all of the frequencies in the solar wind density that would be impacting the magnetosphere. And then we did statistics of all of the frequencies in the dayside magnetosphere in the BZ component. And those results are shown on the right. And then we did a one-to-one study where we said, if there was a discrete frequency in the solar wind density that impacted the magnetosphere, how often was that exact same frequency then in fact detected in GOES, confirming that it was this direct driving? And what we found was that 50% of the time, basically, that the solar wind had a discrete frequency in its density, that we found evidence for direct driving in the magnetosphere. So a lot. Now, we haven't actually answered the question of why there are discrete frequencies in the magnetosphere. We just moved the problem, right? We said, well, the discrete frequencies in the magnetosphere are because there were discrete frequencies in the solar wind. But now we've just moved the question. Now we have to say, why were there discrete frequencies in the solar wind in the first place? Yeah, so let me say about this. I think Simone talked at this group a month ago. This is a slide that he put together. The periodicities in the solar wind are not waves. They're structures, and they're periodic structures, a periodic train of structures that are embedded in the solar wind. And then as that solar wind advects past L1 and the magnetosphere, they appear as a frequency in Earth's reference frame. And so here's just showing with the blue-green as supposed to be density enhancements and rarefactions, that a 5-minute oscillation advecting at 400 kilometers per second is 20 RE, 20 minutes is 75 RE, and then some of these bigger ones that are like an hour, that's 225 RE. And so you can relate these frequencies to the spatial scales, but in the solar wind, it's actually a periodic spatial scale. So that's an important point when we're looking for sources. Okay. And this was an event that Simone published. Like I said, I'm pretty sure he talked to this group a month ago, so go look at his result. But Simone has been carrying the torch forward on this work and has done a really nice job of doing an event study that actually had both this externally driven from the solar wind periodic structures, as well as some internal dynamics going on. And he was able to separate the two kinds of dynamics, even when they're simultaneously going on for the same event. Okay, so like I said, all we've done though is move the problem out. We've now said, okay, but why does the solar wind have these structures in the first place? And so that's why I started going to the sun and doing more solar research, is to look for the cause of these. This is a hard problem though, because here I'm showing GOES SUVI movie, an EUV movie, so about a megakelvin plasma looking at the corona. And what I want you to notice is the incredible complexity in the corona. So when we look at the low corona, like in the SDO movie, we see all of these structures. Which of those structures and how those structures connect out into the solar wind is incredibly complex. It's time dynamic. And we're just starting to get a hint of what that looks like with these GOES SUVI movies. So you can't even answer this question until you can answer from where on the sun does the solar wind come from. Most of the sun are closed magnetic fields. And so most of that structure doesn't immediately go out into the solar wind. All right. And to make it even more complex, a lot of that structure is because of the way the coronal heating is manifesting. And so we also have to understand the coronal heating problem, because that's what makes that plasma hot and of a certain density in the first place. And this is also a three-dimensional time-dependent problem, so it's really hard. Okay, so let's simplify it a little bit and go to a cartoon version of the sun. The sun makes many different types of solar wind. What I'm showing here is just a cartoon version of coronal whole wind, active regions, which I've got color patterned in active polka dots. Polka dots are the active region, and then quiet sun is the hash marks. So this is just the magnetic field on the sun and how coronal heating manifests differently because of that. Coronal holes have the open fields where one foot point is rooted back at the sun and the other foot point is out in the heliosphere. Solar wind that's there, coronal heating immediately imparts the energy and that plasma can flow straight out. Coronal holes are more tenuous and they're a little bit lower in temperature. Quiet sun are closed field regions where both ends of the field connect back to the sun. They're sort of medium temperature and medium density. Active regions are the hottest and the densest. And I'm showing in polka dots here that even though the active regions are complex or are compact relative to the quiet sun, they are magnetically connected to some of these larger scale structures that can open to the solar wind. And so we have to think about, sometimes these are called coronal streamers here. The streamer on the left is comprised of hotter, denser plasma than the streamer on the right. And so if you're making solar wind, the left streamer is being made differently than the right streamer. And we're just now being able to sort of parse out some of this. All right, so the coronal heating problem is hard. The coronal heating problem is hard because the energy release is not directly observable with current resolution. We see that the corona is hot. We see that it's a megakelvin. We see it in these GOES SUVI movies, in the SDO movies, but we can't see the individual energy release events. So we know there's something that happens. Then there's a giant black box of processes that we actually can't measure well in the solar corona. And then what we observe is later, after the energy deposition has occurred, then that energy there's energy deposition in the corona. That energy gets sent down through thermal conduction down into the chromosphere. That material heats up and fills the corona. It's called chromospheric evaporation. And that's what we see. It's way after the actual energization has taken place. It's thermal emission long after the energy deposition. So you've actually lost a lot of the information when we see these EUV images. A lot of the information is already gone. Because that giant black box in the middle of all these processes, it's thermal coupling between the magnetic field up in the corona, down through the transition region, down through the chromosphere, down into the photosphere. There's this coupling all along the magnetic field there through thermal conduction that immediately wipes out any spatial information for where that energy was deposited, making it really hard to match what we're seeing in the images with the physics. Okay, so that's one thing that's hard. That's just and we need to understand that because we need to know what the initial state is of this plasma before it becomes the solar wind. All right, back to the cartoon picture on the left and then our actual data on the right. Again, there's enormous complexity for getting that plasma from the low corona out into the solar wind where it actually goes supersonic and superalfanic and becomes the solar wind. And I'm showing on, you don't have to read the words. What I'm showing on the left is these open field regions where the plasma can stream straight out. And what I was trying to illustrate here, but I'm not sure my illustration skills were so awesome. But what I was trying to illustrate is that this active region can be part of closed field plasma. It can also, the peripheries of the active region can also be part of these open field structures and open straight out into the solar wind. So you can have really hot, dense plasma that all of a sudden has immediate access to the solar wind, or you can have this really hot, dense plasma fill up these closed field regions that then reconnect and can open up. The problem is none of our models, we just don't have the computational capability to get this time dynamic aspect of solar wind release of the closed field plasma into the solar wind. It's just not possible. So our models now have to have these proxies for that reconnection process taking place. And it requires a human going in and realizing that that's what the proxies are for, because we don't have first principles model that can do all of that yet. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get this complex network of closed field structures and understand how sometimes they open up and contribute to solar wind and sometimes they don't. And the way that they open up makes different kinds of structures and different kind of plasma being released into the solar wind. The other thing is that the low closed field and the low corona that we see again with our SDO and even those GOSUBI images are so different than the high corona young solar wind. The plasma rapidly transitions from closed field to open, from these highly non-radial complex fields to pretty radial magnetic field. It goes from collisional to collisionless, the beta changes, the sound speed changes, the alpha speed changes. And that's why even though Parker Solar Probe is making amazing discoveries about the energization in the sort of 10 solar radii corona, it's really most applicable to the coronal holes, which is great, but it really isn't applicable so much to the lower closed field corona. And that's why we'll answer some of the questions with Parker Solar Probe, but there will still be a lot of questions that remain about this low corona and closed field corona and how that opens up to become the solar wind. All right, for time, I'm going to skip this and go right to, okay, we do know some things though about how the corona makes solar wind structures and how those structures get to the magnetosphere. We can do it in some limited instances. So here what I'm showing is at the, actually I should go back. Go back to my cartoon. These fields on the sun, the upper and lower fields, the top and bottom are opposite polarity. This is when the sun can be approximated approximately as a dipole, and that positive field and that negative field way out in the heliosphere where they meet, there's one last closed field line, we call those helmet streamers, and out in the heliosphere, that maps to the heliospheric current sheet. And this is a known place where closed fields reconnect and make plasma, solar wind plasma, because it's at the heliospheric current sheet. And we've observed this. And here's a series of observations where we've tracked periodic release of plasma from one of these helmet streamers that was at the heliospheric current sheet. So this is a series of stills from the Core 2 images and then also the Secchi High 1. We just tracked the structures coming out. Time goes, in both cases, time goes up. And on the right one, it goes from down to up and then from right to left. So the opposite of standards. But anyway, we saw these tracked these series of structures coming out. And we took the FFT of that and we saw that they were coming out quasi-periodically. About every 90 minutes was the standard periodicity coming out. So that largest scale structure that we had seen driving the magnetosphere years ago, we can now say that those kinds of structures are formed at the sun. It's hard to see anything smaller than that from the sun because we don't have the resolution yet. But these 90-minute structures we can get. And going back to that Kepko et al. 2002 paper, that in that particular event, in fact, we looked at the composition of that event because composition is frozen in back at the corona as structures are made. So if there are compositional changes associated with the density changes, then we know those came from the sun and survived all the way to 1 AU. And in fact, the Kepko et al. Result that drove the magnetosphere, that was a 90-minute structure that had compositional changes. It was located at the heliospheric current sheet. And so we know it's this type of event. And there are theories as to why the heliospheric current sheet would make a 90-minute structure. One of the ideas is tearing mode at the heliospheric current sheet. But 90 minutes is one of the size scales that seems to be made at the heliospheric current sheet and come all the way to L1 and then drive magnetospheric dynamics. What about some of the smaller ones? Like I said, we don't quite have the resolution yet to test that, but we have seen compositional changes. This is an event where we saw just in the alpha to proton ratio that there was compositional changes associated with the proton density changes. And these happened on a scale of about 30 minutes. So some of these smaller scale structures come from the sun as well. That's what the composition changes tell us. We can't track these all the way yet, though, in our imaging data. They fall below the noise floor. This is another one of Simone's events. He looked in Helios, which is up until Parker Solar Probe, that was the closest that we had ever gotten to the sun. And he found structures in Helios as well, sort of another layer of circumstantial evidence saying really that these things that were formed at the sun, at least sometimes, survive all the way through the inner heliosphere. And he found some structures like we were seeing at L1, where there were these larger scale sort of 90-minute structures, and then embedded within it, these shorter kind of 20 to 30-minute structures. This is another study where we looked at L1 data in ACE. This is our grad student who just graduated, Irina Gershkovich. She looked at ACE composition, again, to make the connection between what ACE was seeing and what we were able to see back at the sun. And she started looking at some of the highest resolution composition data that ACE has. ACE can go as high as 12 minutes. The count rates get really sparse then, and so you lose a lot of your actual events. But she has found a number of events now where she was able to get 12-minute data. And so again, you can do sort of those 30-minute structures and longer and connect those back to the sun in a general sense that they were formed at the sun. How am I doing? Okay. Here is a Parker Solar Probe pass imaging, again, some of these structures as they're coming off of the sun and entering the heliosphere. This is from Encounter 6. And you can just see all of the detail, all of the structures. Again, we had hints of this with Stereo Core 2, but really being able to see some of the details of these structures after they come off the sun. After they come off the sun, but when they're frozen into the solar wind, is really helping us to be able to have a better feel for what these structures look like and where they're coming from. Again, the ideas about why they might be periodic. One of them is at the current sheet, at the heliospheric current sheet, it could be tearing mode, and that gets set up at a particular frequency. Could have something to do with loading or unloading of the reconnection timescales, because we also see them away from the heliospheric current sheet sometimes. And so those could be just a different variety. It could be a different thing setting the scale sizes there. And then we also see these different scale sizes. And so probably the 90-minute structures from the tearing mode are probably different than these 10, 20, 30-minute structures that we also see. There was also an idea of there are different kinds of waves in the corona, and that those waves could be driving reconnection. At these locations where those last closed field lines are adjacent to an open field line, you can get interchange reconnection, where the closed field swaps foot points with the open field and releases its plasma out. And if you did that pseudo-periodically, you could make some structures in the solar wind. But we're still just starting to look at this. This is a simulation by Aleda Higginson, where she simulated how reconnection at the heliospheric current sheet at those last closed field lines, how that might look. And here we're looking down, like looking down on the pole of the sun. And she's highlighted the structures, actually in B field, but with the white and the black, to illustrate the kinds of structures that would be made. Sometimes it's just pinch off reconnection where the streamer just disconnects totally. And sometimes you get this interchange reconnection where the closed field adjacent to the open field swaps field. And anyway, I just thought this was so reminiscent of the kinds of things we're seeing in WSPR and the scales. Her simulation does not have coronal heating in it yet. It's fully 3D so that it can get the magnetic field right, but it doesn't. It's difficult at this time to simultaneously put in the thermodynamics. And so we can sort of do pieces of the problem, but computationally, it's not possible to do the whole problem at once right now. All right, so let me talk about the review paper, the mesoscale review paper. I've been talking really specifically about the periodic mesoscale structures in the solar wind, but there's a whole zoo of mesoscale structures that if there's a piece of the B field that turns south for a half hour, or if the mesoscale structure contains some of these density structures, there are lots of ways that mesoscale structures can do sort of this smaller driving, but the daily driving of the magnetosphere. So this is another illustration that we made. On the left, we've listed different phenomena that occur in the solar wind. And at the smallest scale are kinetic scale things. In the middle are the mesoscales, and we've got things like these density structures that I'm talking about, these disconnections at the streamer blobs, microstreams. And at the largest scale are the things like SIR, CIR, CMEs. And we know that on the largest scale, everything at that largest scale comes from the sun, and it survives and it impacts the Earth pretty much the way it left. On the kinetic scales, the stuff that leaves the sun immediately gets turned over and processed, and it's destroyed. That's what these middle bars show, is that they're immediately evolving. On the mesoscales, you have this, the 1 AU sort of 4-day time scale is enough that there's some processing, but not a lot of processing. So some of the scales survive, but not all of them. You'll also notice that Earth's magnetosphere is listed as a solar wind phenomena. Of course, it's not, but it's just there for comparative scales. This was the point I made earlier too. The Earth's magnetosphere, as compared to solar wind structures, is quite small compared to these things that are just sort of mesoscale in the solar wind. And then what I'm showing on the right is that our observations are insufficient to get the mesoscales. Our simulations are insufficient to get the mesoscales. Simulation-wise, you can do an MHD scale simulation that kind of gets the global dynamics, but you can't simultaneously resolve the mesoscales. On the other hand, you can do a fully kinetic scale simulation that really captures, the dynamics of reconnection, but then you can't scale that up all the way through the mesoscales. And so the mesoscales are really missing in our simulations of how the solar wind is formed and how it gets to the Earth. Observationally, it's the same story. The remote images that we have can capture the global dynamics, but you can't get small enough or sensitive enough to really follow those structures to the Earth. They fall below the noise floor and as well as the resolution capabilities. And then conversely, the in situ measurements, of course, get great details, but we have at most right now, I think, 3 points in the solar wind besides L1. And so in situ. So it's just not anywhere near to the amount that you need to really map from the detailed kinetics up to the mesoscale structures. And certainly you can't get global from that. I think I said all of this actually. Yep, I said all of this. And then as I said before, the mesoscales, some of them are created newly through turbulence and things like that, but the ones that come from the sun, they drive the magnetosphere, so that's important. And they also tell us about that history of how that solar wind was made in the first place. All right, and I said all of those things. Okay, so I'm the mission scientist for PUNCH. PUNCH is polarimeter to unify the corona and heliosphere, so I have to make a plug for this because I think PUNCH is going to help us with solve a lot of these mesoscale solar wind problems. The PI is Craig DeForest, and the project scientist is Sarah Gibson. So PUNCH is a SMEX that is in phase C right now and set to launch in a few years. It's 4 small sats that will be in LEO in a polar orbit. And the 4 satellites, between the 4 of them, they're going to image the solar corona and heliosphere. So think like SOHO, think like stereosecchi, but rapid, deep field, full coverage, better time resolution, better spatial resolution, and better sensitivity so that we can capture that global scale and map it to the mesoscale. So this is, on the left, a reminder of that zoom in of the core 2 deep field exposures that we had, because that's the kind of sensitivity, time resolution, and spatial resolution we're going to be able to achieve on PUNCH, taking these white light density images of the whole heliosphere. And then what I'm showing on the right is how that little, that high resolution block maps to what PUNCH is going to put together. Between the 4 spacecraft, they're going to make mosaic images like this that fill in this entire region on the right. So that whole outer circle is made at a lower time resolution, and that whole inner yellow circle is made at a very high time cadence, comparable to what I'm showing on the left. And in comparison, you can see where stereo high 1 and stereo high 2 imaged. Stereo high 1 are those blue boxes, and stereo high 2 are the gray boxes. And you can see that they don't get anything over the poles of the sun. That was by design. Stereo was ecliptic, going after ecliptic measurements. But we don't have hardly any data over the poles of the sun. And as I said, PUNCH is going to have much higher spatial resolution, sensitivity, and time resolution to really be able to capture, not just see those mesoscale structures when they come off the sun, but actually be able to track them as they go out through the inner heliosphere and see how they evolve. All right, and just a reminder, this is so important because all these structures that make it to the Earth's magnetosphere, they drive dynamics as they should, because look at how big they are compared to dayside Earth's magnetosphere. And these density structures are dynamic pressure structures from the perspective of the magnetosphere. So Larry Kepko and I did a study a couple of years ago where we looked at a series of events at L1 that were upstream of compression regions, either SIRs or CIRs, and I think one of them was even actually a CME. And we looked at the structures within those, and it turned out that it wasn't like the shock itself that drove dynamics in the magnetosphere. It was the structures embedded upstream that were compressed periodic density structures. And because they were compressed periodic density structures, they drove the magnetosphere probably even better. And so I'm showing an event here where the top 2 panels show the solar wind upstream of the magnetosphere having these periodic density structures in them. And of course, the dynamic pressure is in the middle panel, the second panel, panel B. Panel C is goes BZ, having that exact same driven frequency, directly driven by the solar wind. And then the bottom 3 panels show that the radiation belt responded. LANL responded, the flux increased in LANL at a similar frequency, and most importantly, Polar saw evidence of particle precipitation. So we know that these structures can be correlated with particle precipitation from the radiation belts. And we've got a project that Simone's been leading to really do a more thorough investigation of this sort of response from end to end, from the solar wind structures through the magnetosphere, through the radiation belt, through particle precipitation. I'm just going to end on one last event. This one was led by Simone, but what he did was he showed another one of these events where we've got periodic density structures. They impact the magnetosphere. They drive field line resonances, but they also drive this global response in the ULF waves. And so what the bottom panels show are different ground magnetometers, and they light up black when they are seeing the exact same frequency as this directly driven frequency from the solar wind. And so you can see sometimes just a couple of black dots. That means probably it found a little field line resonance or something. But when the whole panel lights up black, like this one here in the bottom left corner, that just went, that means the whole magnetosphere responded, and it was this global driving of the magnetosphere. Like I said, I'm pretty sure Simone talked to you about that a month ago, so go see that for more details. But what I wanted to point out was that our postdoc Samantha Wallace, who is working with our team, she mapped this structure, the solar wind structure, back to the sun to see what formed it in the first place. And we're just on sort of the first step of this right now. But what she's able to do, these maps are super complicated. They require a whole PhD to understand. So the takeaway is that the upper left is a Carrington map of the sun. The colored portions are the bits of the sun that are open. And then they do a ballistic, they do a mapping, propagation mapping based off of the velocity of the solar wind. And then they also have a potential field source surface model to figure out the magnetic connectivity, that complex connectivity from the source surface back down to where on the sun the structures come from. And so it's hard. So here's the takeaway. The takeaway is Sam did the mapping for this event, and she showed that the blue arrow that goes up and to the right on the 4th of November, that shows where this event came from. It came from that active region. That's where she shows that it mapped to. And then we cross the heliospheric current sheet and we go into solar wind that comes from another active region. It comes from all of a sudden the active region that the arrow pointing to the lower left around November 7th is pointed to. So we're in one active region. That active region makes solar wind that has periodic density structures, which then drive the magnetosphere at the exact same frequencies. We cross the heliospheric current sheet. All of a sudden, we're in wind coming from a totally different active region, and that active region did not make periodic density structures. We don't know why it didn't. We just know that something about the connectivity, we can start to differentiate that there are different sources that are making different kinds of structures and in different ways. So like I said, this is sort of the 0th order step to really being able to predict when this sort of interaction will occur. But Sam's been working hard on this. And so I will just conclude with these two movies that show that even during the most quiescent times, the solar atmosphere is highly complex in both time and space. And because of that, the way the solar wind is made is filled with these mesoscale structures. And there's a variety of different ways that these mesoscale structures can be formed and the way that they can take place. I've been focusing on these periodic ones, but there's actually a whole zoo of different kinds of mesoscale structures and then different ways that those would drive the magnetosphere. Now, of course, the space weather they create is not the same as a big CME or a big CIR, but it's the ground state of space weather in that it's the space weather that occurs every day. It can have effects on the radiation belts. And it is really important also for the preconditioning for when that CME does get there or when that CIR does get there. All right, and I'll stop there and take questions.
Hello, can you guys hear me? I hope so.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Nicki. So it was very interesting. Well, I missed some parts because the internet here is so bad at this time. And Zoom was not helping at all. We have one question from Ethan Reeve in the chat. Are the periodic density structures observable in the ground magnetometers? If so, are they still considered ULF waves?
Yeah, so that was actually, we've done some work, but also the most recent one was this paper by Simone where he saw, we observed them at L1 in the solar wind. Then we observed them in the GOES magnetometer when GOES was in the dayside magnetosphere. And then these maps here are of Simone identifying them in the ground magnetometer stations. And he's done, so they light up black when they see the exact same frequency. In terms of the precise range of the frequencies, some of them are formally in the ULF wave category, formally in the PC5 category. But some of the lower frequency ones, like the long 90-minute structure, is probably a different response than like the 10-minute oscillations and the 20-minute oscillations. There we're probably looking at dynamics that maybe impact in the way of things like magnetopause shadowing of the radiation belt, because it just comes in and is there and stays there and then relaxes and then it's there for a while and then it comes back in for 45 minutes. But yeah, here he's looking at 1.5 millihertz to 5 millihertz directly driven waves. Other questions?
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have other question? Please, you can unmute yourself and ask if you have more questions. Well, it seems that everything was clear. Thank you very much.
All right, so well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Sorry for the technical problems. That happens. Not frequently, but happens.
It's all good. Thank you.
So for the next week, for next Monday on October 24th, we'll have Chris Chatham. We'll be discussing radiation belt dropouts and drift bounce resonance in the broadband electromagnetic waves. I hope to see you all here again. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.